Hello, everyone. I'm Dennis Uddings, Head of Marketing from Alumio. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar Experience iPaaS for Experts. This comes after successfully hosting the webinar Experience iPaaS for Beginners that was held 2 weeks ago, where we introduced Alumio's iPaaS and demonstrated how to create basic integration. The video of this webinar is available on our YouTube channel, so if you're interested, feel free to check it out. Now, let's start to give you an in-depth demo of using Alumio's advanced features of Alumio's no-code integration platform. So with today's expert webinar, we plan to broadly demo 3 advanced functionalities. First, we will show you how to create a custom integration. Second, we will create an integration flow using the connected packages where orders are sent from the e-commerce platform to the popular ERP Microsoft Dynamics 365. After that, we would like to show you how to benefit from using Alumio's advanced integration features, where we would like to do this based upon your requests and live input. We will also having a post-webinar Q&A and open discussion where anyone of your interest is discussing questions and queries about Alumio in more detail. So, okay, let's start with the first topic. But before we jump into the live demo, our integration specialist, Jesse Buitenhuis, would like to present you with a 3-minute quick tour. How Alumio helps you to create custom integrations. An integration often starts with the wish to connect 2 systems. Alumio's iPaaS allows you to create connections to any protocols, as you can see in the left, like databases, APIs, SOAP, files via FTP. This could be XML, JSON, CSV, or EDI to connect your customers and suppliers. Or just use a webhook so information can be sent to Alumio. In Alumio, you start with creating connections to both the left side, called incoming, and the right side, called outgoing connection. The data route is the glue. It connects the incoming and outgoing, and which will be your integration of a specific data or business flow. After creating a connection, the data of the connected system is available in Alumio. Alumio takes care of the authentication and provides a stable connection, including logging and monitoring. As you already know, you need to make sure that the data of the incoming connection, here shown in the green box, must be transferred to the required format of the connected system, as shown in the purple box. As you can see in this example, the product data has a different structure, name conventions, and some data which need to be filtered out because it's not needed. Some data needs to be combined in order to meet the required format. Alumio provides integration features which can be used via our easy-to-use interface to do this mapping of data. I now like to introduce our integration specialist, Jesse, to show how to create a custom integration in the interface of Alumio. He will connect the orders from Dynamics 365 and send them to an FTP-server, just to show you how you can create any flow you want. Jesse, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you. Yes, hello, my name is Jesse Buitenhuis, and thanks for watching. So last time we had this first webinar where we showed some basic integrations, and for today's webinar we will be creating a custom one which will be a bit more advanced. We are going to utilize more of the transformers that Alumio has to offer, so yeah, we really can tailor an integration to our needs. So as Dennis described, when we create an integration, what we call a route, we have 2 components. When we are creating a route, we can see that we can configure a incoming configuration, which is responsible for pulling the data to Alumio. And we can create an outgoing configuration, which is responsible for sending the data somewhere. So this is quite, still quite broad because, yeah, we can send data to Alumio, but via what protocols? Well, if we take a look at creating an incoming configuration, we can see that an incoming configuration uses a subscriber. And a subscriber is the component that's responsible for pulling the data from a system. So what we can do is we can create a custom component to connect to a REST API. So we can do RESTful interfaces such as Magento, Shopware, but also Dynamics Finance and Operations. We have a database subscriber in case I want to do direct database connections. So there's some older ERP systems which don't have a web service. In this case, it's useful. In this case, it's useful to directly connect to a database. So Alumio offers many of these subscribers to create a connection with an external system. But we also have a webhook subscriber. And with a webhook subscriber, we can enable an API endpoint for an external system to send data to Alumio. But in this case, what we are going to do, we are going to connect to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. We are going to read some order headers from that system, and we are going to send those to an FTP location. So before I start creating the incoming and the outgoing configuration, I need to configure the endpoints. Because often what you're going to do, you're going to connect to a system to which you are going to pull many types of data from. So the first system is Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. So I will be going to clients and then to HTTP clients. And I've already provided a configuration for this system. So let me go ahead and open it. We can see I created an HTTP client for Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. Down here, we see that an HTTP client uses various plugins. Well, a plugin adds functionality to an HTTP client. So an HTTP client enables you to do API calls to a certain system, and those plugins enhance those API calls. So the first plugin that we have added is an add base URI to requests. As we can see, this contains a environment variable. That's what we call it. And this environment variable stores the information about the URL of the finance and operation system. Then down here, we have added a extra plugin to add the content type headers to the request. So if you're going to send JSON data to this API, then the server needs to know, because then the server knows, okay, I need to process JSON data. But we can also send XML, CSV, basically any type of content that we need to send to a system. But we don't want to manually configure those headers every time. So we let Alumio decide it based on the payload. And also we added a plugin to enable the logging. So obviously when we are going to connect to the system, messages will be created and we want to have the full visibility of what's happening. So in this case, I selected the full formatter. So what will happen is that Alumio will create full logging of everything that happens with this specific system. Also, I can add more plugins I would like to. So for example, we can enable caching right through the user interface. So now when we are requesting the same API endpoint within a given time frame, Alumio is able to cache the request. So instead of sending an actual request to the ERP system, Alumio will read the result from the cache. And this way you increase the performance of the integrations that you're going to build. So you're free to, in your own Alumio environment, check all the plugins that we have available. We have many of them, and they all make it easier for you to interface with an API in this case. Then down here, we can also see that I configured a authentication. And an authentication basically contains information for you to say, okay, I'm authorized to view those resources. So if I'm going to pull order information, the system needs to know, okay, you are entitled to do so. This authentication enables that functionality. We can also configure this from the user interface. So let me go ahead and open this authentication. We can see that we have an authentication configured here, which is for finance and operations. And when I open it up, we can see that down here, it uses an OAuth 2 authentication with a generic provider where the grant type is client credentials, but of course you can tailor it to your needs. So you can also do interactive authorization. This will redirect you to a login page. You can provide your credentials and then Alumio will carry on from there. But we also have password, authorization code, all the common grant types that you would see with a OAuth 2 authorization. Then down here, we can see that we have a client ID, a client secret, a token URL. Well, yeah, everything that's just specific to this OAuth 2 authentication. So all you have to do then is press this button once, retrieve an access token key. I will just do so. Alumio will retrieve a key, it will store it in the cache, and Alumio will then use this key for each subsequent request. So I only have to configure this information once, and then every time I'm going to connect with this specific system, Alumio will read this key from the storage and apply it to each request. Okay, so when I go back to my HTTP client, we can see that I selected the authentication here. So I will go ahead and press save. So now we have created HTTP client and we have we have the component that's needed in order to create connectivity to finance and operations. Then we have a second endpoint, which is the FTP location, because we are going to pull orders from Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, and we are going to send them to an SFTP location. So in order to do so, you have to configure a file system within Alumio. So I will go to storages and to file systems. Then here we can see that we have an Alumio SFTP location file system configured. Down here we see that I've selected the FTP over SSH option, but you can also connect to a direct FTP, but also to a Google Cloud Storage, an HTTP system, but also, for example, to a Amazon S3 bucket. Then down here we can see the specifics of this file system. So we have a host, which is also an environment variable, a username, a password in this case. I've also defined a root directory where Alumio needs to connect to, and the rest of the information I've left as is. Now I will go ahead and press save again. I will go back to the overview, and I will verify if the connection works, because sometimes an FTP location is behind the firewall, or you might make a mistake in the credentials. You just need to be ensured that whatever you configured also works. So we can go to the actions. We can click on the 3 dots, and then we can press on test connection. Now we see configuration successful. When I click on this, I can go to the logs. Not sure if it's going to create any for this case. No. So it's just going to say configuration successful, which means Alumio was able to connect to this specific system. So now we have the 2 endpoints configured. So we have an HTTP client to do the REST API calls to Finance and Operations, and we have a file system to interface with this SFTP directory. So now what I can do, I can create the incoming configuration to pull the order headers to Alumio, and I can create the outgoing configuration to write the XML files that we are going to create to this FTP or SFTP directory. So we'll go back to my connections, then to incoming. I'm going to create a new incoming configuration, and we will give this a name. So we can call this Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, and we call this order headers, something like this. Then down here, I'm going to utilize the generic component, because we are creating a custom integration here. But yeah, we are going to do a REST API call, so we can use the HTTP subscriber that's designed to do all those API calls to whatever system. So we have a request URI. So here we only have to provide the endpoint because we already configured the base URL. So I will do it. I think the endpoint is /data/sales order headers, and let's for this purpose only pull the top 10. So we're going to pull the top 10 sales order headers. I'm going to scroll down to the HTTP clients. Down here we will select the client that we configured, because then Alumio knows, okay, whenever I execute this configuration, I need to connect to this endpoint. And now when I press save, and I run this configuration, we can see that the subscriber has been consumed. We can click on it, and it will open this model. And we can also go to the logging. So now when I go to the logging, we can see the logs that were created as soon as I pressed on the run button. So we have we can see that Alumio sent a request to this specific endpoint. We can also see that Alumio added this host based on the HTTP client setting. So we only provided once, and then it's automatically added to each configuration where we connect to the specific system. We can also see the response. So we see the actual OData response from F&O. So we can see that we received one order header, and I think if we scroll down, we have another. And if I'm not mistaken, we will have 10 order headers. So now when I close this, I can also go to the logging tab of my incoming configuration. So when I refresh this, we can also see all the processes that have been started, finished, or are still running. So we can see the status of a process. So this one has finished because we already run it. We already got a result. We can see how late it started, how late it finished, how long it took. So it took 1 second and 180 milliseconds. And we can also see how many tasks have been created. And of those created tasks, how many have been finished, how many have been filtered, or how many have been failed. So as you can see, still 0 tasks have been created. And if you also were here during the previous webinar, you would probably still remember that in order to get tasks, we need to have a route. Because this incoming configuration will only pull the data to Alumio, but as long as there's no route, so there's nothing to connect two systems to one another, Alumio will do nothing with the data. So what we will do, we will go ahead and we will create a outgoing configuration. And I'm going to call this outgoing configuration as FTP write order XML, something like this. And down here we can select the publisher, and this publisher is responsible for sending the data to a system. So again, we can connect to various types of systems. So as Dennis described, we can connect to APIs, SOAP APIs, databases, SFTPs, but also GraphQL. So there's a lot of possibilities to tackle your problem and create your integration. So in this case, we are going to connect to a file system because we connected this SFTP directory. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select the write files to a file system publisher. And this allows me to connect to this file system that we created and write files to that file system. So we'll have like a directory and we are going to store the XML order files there. So what I then need to do, I need to configure the file system, which is in this case the Alumio SFTP. Then we can also say, okay, when a file exists, we want to do something. So we can overwrite the file. That's the default option, but we can also add an increasing number to the file name. So if it already exists, we can just add the extra files. So in this case, I'm just going to go with the default option of overwriting. Then down here, we have the configuration of, okay, how are we going to name the file? So we have a path, as you can see here. And what will be the contents of the file, which is the source. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to first configure the path. So we have two options. We can say, okay, get path from the data. This will be dynamically. So for example, we can take like the order number, and then we will send the order number. We will send the order number to, we will use the order number to create the XML file. Or we have a custom path, so we can also say, okay, it will be something like order.xml. But if we do this, as you can see, it's quite limited. So it really depends on your use case. So what we are going to do, we are going to get the path from the data, and which will be the order number. So this means we will need to introduce a key that's called order number. We can also apply mappers. So it's especially useful if you're going to add multiple fields and you need to combine them, or maybe you need to prepend the text with something. So actually, let's do that. So let's go here for a custom path. What we are going to do, we are going to create a file and we are going to call it order with a hyphen. Then we're going to use a placeholder to take dynamic data. We are going to take the order number. Okay. And we're going to append it with .xml. So now for each order that we are going to process with this configuration, we will get an XML file that starts with order hyphen, followed by the order number, and it will be of the XML file extension. Now what I will do, I will add a mapper to this, and I'm going to call this a string prepend, and we're going to prepend it with Alumio hyphen. So now we would get a file that's called Alumio order number.xml. Then down here, we can provide a source. And again, we can take it from the data, which is dynamic, or we can do custom contents. But I will go with get contents from the data. And we will look for a key that's called order XML. But now, by default, within Alumio, you're always working with JSON. So even if you're reading XML from the source and you're sending XML to the destination, there will be a translation done by Alumio from XML to JSON and from JSON to XML. This is because we think it's easier to work with one unified data format within the system, and then we will take the hard work of translating the data from whatever data from the incoming format to JSON, and from JSON to the outgoing format. So in order to do this, we need to apply a mapper to this data. So what we're going to do, we are going to add a mapper, and it's called the Serialize. We're going to serialize it with as XML. And we will leave this as is. So now I'm going to save this. Okay, so now we created the incoming configuration to pull the data to Alumio. We created an outgoing configuration to send the data to this SFTP location. Now we can create a route to glue the two together. So we have a fully working integration. So we'll go to connections and then to routes. I'm going to create a new route, and we are going to call this sales order headers from D365 FNO to SFTP. I'm going to select the incoming configuration that will pull the information from FNO, and I'm going to select the outgoing configuration that will write XML files to the SFTP directory. And I'm going to make this route a real-time processing. So by default, Alumio is asynchronous, and we have two steps. The first step is to pull the data to Alumio. This will create a queue, and then on a separate process, we are going to process this queue. So this is especially useful when you're reading lots of data from a system, but your destination system is not that performant, so you need to spread the load. So what you can do one API call, or you can read one file that contains 50,000 products, and then separately you can send 100 of those products to that destination system. But in this case, we are only having 10 order headers, so we're going to do real-time processing. So as soon as the API call is finished, the files will be created on the file system. So let's go ahead and press save. So now when I go back to this incoming configuration and I run it, you can see that it has been consumed. Now when I go back to the dashboard, we can also see that there's one task, and we can also see this field. So let me just click ahead, and we will be brought to the task overview page again. So let me just briefly go over what we see here. So we have an identifier, which is just this unique field for Alumio to recognize a task. Then we have the entity type and the entity identifier. And the entity type and the entity identifier are actually quite useful, because the entity type can be used to automatically validate data, but also to set the entity identifier. So right now we are working with sales orders. So ideally, what I would like to see is the sales order reference as the entity identifier. Then if something goes wrong with that specific sales order header or that specific sales order, then it's really easy for me to find all the tasks that belong to that specific sales order, and it's way easier for me to debug. Right now, the entity identifier is a hash, so I'm not sure what we are looking at. So I really have to investigate what's happening, which is not that useful. But we will get in that in just a second. Then we have a status. So in this case, it failed. So I will just show you why it failed. We have a route. We can see how late it was created, how late the last mutation has been, and we have some action. So we can also retry this task if we would like to. So now it disappears from the field list. If I remove this filter, we can see it's new again. So now if I open this task and I go to the entity data, here we can actually see what we got back from FNO. So we can see the 10 sales order headers that we retrieved from FNO, as we would expect. Now when I go to the import messages, we can see those the API call to FNO. And when we go to export messages, we can see the issues. So here we can see a warning or an error was given that the key order number has not been found. So let me just take you back to what we just did. So if we go to this outgoing configuration, we can see that we create this outgoing configuration that writes files to a file system. And down here at the path field, we selected a custom path, and we said, okay, you need to create a path based on this order number. Well, this order number is not available because that's not how it's called in FNO. So in a lot of cases, you're going to get data from a system in the format that the system offers, but you have to make it compatible with the system where it's going to. So for this purpose, we have to apply transformers, which we haven't done in this case. So let's start by creating our first custom transformer. So I'm going to go back to my task. I'm going to go back to the entity data, and I'm going to copy this entity data. So now we'll go to connections and then to entity transformers. And we are going to create a new transformer. So at the right side, we have a transformer tester. Let me make it a little bit bigger. So here we can put in our input data. So this is the data for of this. This is the data before this transformer is executed. And then we can start by configuring our transformer. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a transformer. We are going to call it map D365 FNO sales order header to XML file, something like this. Okay, so let's start by creating the first transformer. We are going to do a chain multiple entity transformers because we are going to solve multiple problems within this transformer. The first one is that we only have one task, even though we have 10 sale order headers. And ideally, we want a task for each unique entity, because then if that entity contains an error, only that specific entity will fail, but the rest of your integration can still carry on like nothing is wrong. So what we want to do, we want to split this up. So the first transformer we are going to use is the get branches from a pattern. So the get branches from a pattern will basically take an array as input, and for each underlying item, it will create a unique object, and that unique object will then become a task. So now if I provide a pattern, which will be value.star, because here, if we take a look at our entity data, we can see that we have a key named value, and which is an array that contains objects. So each object will represent a sales order header. So when I press run test, we can see that we receive a response, and now each of the objects has been split up. So that's step one. Then the second step is we need to remap the fields. So if we take a look again at our outcome configuration, we are saying, okay, we want to take data of an order number field, and we want to fill the contents of the XML file with the contents of the order XML key. So both keys don't exist, so we need to make sure those exist. So what are you going to do? We're going to, in our transformer, I'm going to do a move using a pattern. I'm going to move everything. I will do a star. I'm going to move it to order XML.$1. So now when I hit run test, we can now see that for each object we have an order XML key. So that's step one. So we now have the contents of our XML file. But now we still need the order number, because otherwise Alumio cannot create the file names. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add another transformer. I'm going to use the value setter. The key will be order number, because that's what we decided in the outcome configuration. And we are going to take the value of our data. So in this case, I'm going to look for a unique field in this data. So I believe there will be a sales order number field here. So yeah, let's just carry on with the assumption that this field is unique. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create it as a placeholder, so it will become a variable. And now I can fill this field dynamically. So in this case, I'm going to say, okay, take the value of order XML dot sales order number. So now what Alumio will do, it will add a key named order number, and it will fill it with the value of order XML dot sales order number. Or with other words, it's going to look for the key order XML. It's going to assume it's an object, and so within the order XML key, it will look for the sales order number key that we just had here. So when I hit run test, we can see we now also have the order number key. But we will have one more issue, because right now we did not define an entity type. So we will still, if you take a look at the task overview that we have, we will still have, for the new tasks, we will have an entity type default, and we will still have an entity identifier that doesn't really say anything. So what we're going to do, we are going to define a custom entity type, which we can use to set this entity identifier. So I'm going to go to clients and then to entity types. I'm going to add a new entity type, and an entity type in this case will be D365 FNO sales order, something like this, header. Then down here, we can define a identifier path. And this identifier path will be order number. So we are going to take the value of the order number field and display it in the task overview. So I will hit save. I will go back to my transformer. I'm going to configure the last transformer that we are going to do, and it will be the set the entity type. And now I'm going to assign the entity type that we just created, the D365 F&O sales order header. I'm going to hit save. Okay, so now what we did, we created this transformer, it was created, now we can apply it to our integration. So if we go back to our connections and then to routes, select the route that we just created. I'm going to add the transformer that we just created, map the sales order header to XML file. Okay, going to hit save. Now we will run the incoming configuration again. So we will take a little bit longer. Okay, we can see the subscriber has been consumed. And now when I go back to the task overview, we can now see that we have 10 new tasks. We have a new entity type that we just defined. We have an entity identifier, which is the order number. So we can now, okay, let's say there's an issue with order number 9. All I have to do, I go to filters. I look for entity identifier 09, something like this. And then we'll only get the tasks that belong to that specific entity. So it's way easier for me to find specific pieces of data within my integration. Yes, now when I open this task, I go to the export messages, we can see it has been finished. So now let me just quickly switch my screen to the FTP location. Now we can see that we have all the files created here with Alumio -order number.xml. So now let me open one of those files. So I have to switch my screen once more. So it's a little bit small, but as you can see, Alumio now created an XML file for this specific order header. So this way, we just used Alumio to create our custom integration. So let me just go back to my Alumio instance, recap what we did. And then we go switch it to this, okay. Okay, so to recap what we did, we created an integration between Dynamics Finance and Operations to pull sales order headers and send those sales order headers after some transformations to the SFTP location. So we started by creating the endpoints. So we first had so Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations uses a REST API. So we created an HTTP client for this. And this HTTP client contains all the shared information for whatever endpoint data endpoint you're going to consume. We created a file system in order to interface with this SFTP directory. So this allows us to write files to an external system, but we can also use the same file system to read the files from that system. So we can also do it the other way around. So maybe another system is putting files on the SFTP directory, which we have to read and import into Dynamics F&O. We can also use those same configurations for this. Then what we did is we created an incoming configuration, which uses a custom HTTP subscriber in order to read the sales order headers from Dynamics F&O or Finance and Operations. We created a outgoing configuration that's configured to connect to that SFTP directory and write a XML file to it. And then we created the transformer that's responsible for splitting the single API call to multiple tasks, then introducing the keys that we need. So we define this order XML key, we define the order number key. And to make the integration even better, we applied an entity type in order to set that entity identifier to make it more easy to administer the integration. So now all there is left to do for me is create a scheduled job, because right now I have to run this manually. So what I would do is I would go to settings, then to the scheduler. I would define a job and I would call this get sales order headers from F&O and send to SFTP, something like this. I would select the incoming configuration job. I would select the incoming configuration that we created. and then how often I want it to run. So let's say I want to run it every minute. I will hit save, and now Alumio will automatically pull those sales order headers to Alumio and send an XML file to the SFTP location. So that concludes the first section of the webinar, and back to you, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you for that, and showing us how you can use Alumio to create custom integrations. Great job. Let's go to the next topic. In this topic, we will show you how to make an integration using Alumio's connector packages. First of all, to explain in simple words, Alumio's connector packages are just a safe set of pre-configured mappers and transformers, as you have shown in the previous section by Jesse. These connector packages make it easier and fast to kickstart your integration. In the next topic, Jesse will show how the order from the e-commerce is being shown to is being sent to the Dynamics 365 ERP. But first, check this example, which shows you that in a lot of examples, more systems are connected. The data routes are connected to a data scheme in the middle. By using this data scheme, you really boost the reusability of the integration. It allows you to use connector packages from our marketplace, and it simplifies your IT landscape enormously, which benefits such as makes it easier to change systems. If you have an order, it makes it easier to send the order as well to this warehouse management system, to the PIM system, to the CRM, the loyalty, etc. So in general, you could say that an iPaaS makes your IT and your company ready for digital growth. So to summarize once again, connector packages are just saved configuration of transformers and mappers from a pre-built integration. Technically, as I've been told, it's just a JSON file, but please ask Jesse all about it. Your connector packages can be built by using the software development kit. And in order to understand more about this SDK, we will organize a webinar later this year in the end of December. Jesse will now show you how to create an integration flow where orders from the e-commerce systems are sent to Dynamics 365 F&O. So the floor is yours again, Jesse. You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, we are going to continue. We are going to use Magento to read the orders, and we are going to use our Magento order connector. What will then happen is Alumio will automatically transform this Magento order to an Alumio schema order, and from that point on, we can automatically transfer it to a finance and operations order and import it. So for this, we have to rely on two external systems. So the first one is Magento. I think I will be logged out. Yeah. So let me go ahead and log in. So we have some orders here, and we will also create a new one. And the second system we rely on is finance and operations. So let me go ahead and start this new session. Okay, and what we will do, we look for Alumio orders. So right now this environment is empty. So what we need to do, we need to pull the orders from Magento 2, let the connector transform it, and then send these orders to finance and operations. So in order to do so, even though it's a connector, we need to start by defining the endpoint. And the endpoint in this case is Magento, for which I have nothing set up as of right now. So I will go to clients and I will go to HTTP clients. I'm going to add a new client and we will call this Magento 2. Then we are going to define the plugins to enhance this request. So again, this HTTP client allows us to quickly define shared settings among multiple data endpoints. So the first most commonly used plugin is the add base URI to request plugin. So here we need to provide a URL. So instead of using an environment variable, I'm just going to go to this Magento instance and take the URL and paste it in here. As we can see is that the trailing slashes are ignored, so I'm just removing it as a best practice, because sometimes people leave it here and then they are confused because they think, okay, I have this trailing slash configured here, so why is it not working? So it's always a good idea to just remove it, because as the system already tells you, it's being ignored anyway. Then I'm going to add a plugin to add the content type headers to the request. So yeah, we are going to work with JSON, but maybe for in the future you are also going to send XML. But then I don't want to manually apply a content type. Instead, I want Alumio to be smart enough to recognize, okay, now I'm sending JSON, so I'm adding those headers, or now I'm sending XML, I'm going to add the XML headers. We are also going to enable the logging. Let's do full logging. And okay, that's step one. Now the second step is we need to authenticate ourselves, because yeah, Alumio doesn't want everybody to be able to read the order data. Instead, Alumio will need to know, okay, the person requesting this data has the rights to do so. So what we need to do for Magento is we need to do a request. We need to do a request with our credentials, and the Magento will return a token, and this token has to be used in the actual request to pull the data to Alumio. So what will happen is we are going to do pull orders from Magento. Magento will say, okay, give me your token. So we need to make something to get a token. So for this purpose, I'm going to select the request authentication method. And with the request authentication method, we can tackle many authentications. So you have, for example, a JWT token authentication, which we can tackle with this. But also SAP by design has a specific way where you need to log in, you need to get a session cookie, and you need to pass this with each subsequent request. But also with Magento. So for Magento, we need to do an API call where we provide the credentials, and at that API call, we will return the token, which we will have to pass in a header. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to paste the authentication URL in here. So it's the same Magento system as we can see, but instead we are going to consume this API, which is /rest all v1 integration admin token. We are going to do a post request, and we are going to send the parameters with the request. So we need to log in as the admin account in this case, because then we can just access everything. So we are going to provide a username and a password. We are going to do this request over the default HTTP client, because we are not going to create a specific one for this. So when would you create a specific HTTP client for your authentication? Well, you would do so when that specific authentication is also behind authentication. So sometimes in order to do this request, you need to provide like basic authentication, which is behind a firewall or something. So then we can create a separate HTTP client that's used for this authentication call. And yeah, so you can make it really hard if it's required. Then we have the header name. So once this request has been done and we take the result, we want to pass that result in the authorization header. Then we have the source. So now we say, okay, we want to take this piece of this request and provide it in an authorization header. So in this case, I'm going to select the request body, because the token will be returned from in the request body. I'm just going to paste the template in here. So basically what we will say, okay, add an authorization header with the value bearer with a space, and then a variable to that takes the token of this request. So let me go ahead and hit save. So now we define this endpoint. So now we have a means to connect to Magento. So now we can go ahead and create our integration. So what I will do, I will go to connections and then to incoming. I'm going to define a new incoming configuration. We are going to call this Magento orders. And remember when I just showed you all those generic components? So we have like HTTP subscriber to do an API call to a REST API call. We have a SOAP subscriber to do like a SOAP API call, and so on. But for this purpose, I'm going to use a connector. And a connector provides templates for you to easily interface or connect to a system. So in this case, I'm going to connect to Magento. And I want to pull orders. So I'm going to select the Magento 2 order subscriber. Oh, Magento 2 order subscriber. Then down here, we can see that I have to provide the minimum information to Magento or to Alumio. So Alumio knows, okay, I need to connect to this Magento system. The first field is the HTTP client. So this is the client that we just created because this client contains the authentication, contains a specific Magento instance or any other information that's needed. So instead of selecting the default client, I will select Magento 2 in here. Then down here, we have the mutation date storage path. And this mutation date storage path is used by the connector in order to keep track of where we are at. So let's say Magento is down. So Magento is down because of maintenance, or Magento is maybe down because you did a release and something broke. Then Alumio will remember, okay, this is the last moment where we successfully pulled data from Magento. And then if your Magento shop is down for 3 days and it's available 3 days later again, Alumio will take a look at the date in the storage and use this to pull the newer information. So this way you will never lose any data. But also it's used to not process the same entity twice. So let's say I already processed an order. I don't need to process it again. It will not be picked up because we are going to use this date to do a check if we already processed the data from the date. But we can also do more checks. We can check if the order has a specific status, if the order matches certain conditions. You have the full flexibility to configure this using the transformers that I showed you. Then we can also pull the data from a specific system, a specific store. So this is really Magento-specific knowledge, but in Magento you can have multiple websites, and maybe you have multiple regions that you're serving. So maybe you're serving the European region, but maybe also the Nordics. And maybe for each region, you have a different ERP system. So maybe for Europe West or the EMEA region, you have like SAP. Maybe for North America, you have Business Central, something like that. What we can do, we can just pull the orders from the specific store and route them to another channel. Then we can also provide a data limit. So by default, it will pull 50 orders at once, and then it will next time request the latest 50 orders. But you can also request more. So it really depends on your requirements. If you have a high volume store, you are likely to do a higher data limit and execute this configuration more often. But if you have a low volume store, let's say I only have 50 orders per day, then it's sensible to maybe only pull 10 orders every time this is executed. And then we have a starting date. So when this has never been executed, this storage will be empty. So then we need to provide a starting date. So if the storage is empty, then Alumio will get all the orders starting from the 1st of January 1970. And then from that point on, it will just read the date from the storage and automatically add it to the request. So let's go ahead and hit save. Now I'm going to create the outcome configuration. I'm going to add a new one. We are going to call it Dynamics 365 FNO create order, something like this. I'm going to call a custom endpoint in here. I'm going to use a template transformer. So I'm going to paste it here. But down here, I'm going to go to the transformers, and I'm going to select a specific template. This will map the order from the Alumio schema to D365 or whatever is needed. So let me go ahead and hit save. So now we'll go back to connections and then to routes. I'm going to create a new route. I'm going to call this orders from Magento 2 to Dynamics 365 FNO. We're going to select the incoming configuration that we just created and the outgoing configuration that we just created. And now I'm going to hit save. Now we'll run the incoming configuration. So I'm going to connect to Magento and pull the order data. Okay, we see the subscriber has been consumed. So that means the authentication that we configured worked. And we can also verify this by going to the logs. Because we go to the logs, we can see that Alumio will first do a request, a post request to get the admin token as what we have configured. Then we see we receive a response, which contains a token. And then Alumio will proceed to do the actual request, as we can see here. And we can also see that Alumio adds this authorization header that contains the value of the token. So this way we authenticated ourselves to Magento. Okay, we have the rights to pull the order information. So now if I go to this mutation day storage path and I press view configuration and I go to the entities, it's empty, but I will show you why. I was expecting it to be filled, but we did not fully complete all the required steps yet. Because now if I go to the dashboard and I go to the new tasks, we can see that there's one new task. But again, we can see there the entity type is default. The entity identifier is some weird hash again. And yeah, the rest of the fields already explained. So when we click through and we go to the entity data, we basically see the result of this API call. But that's not what we want. We want to automatically transform this data to something Alumio can work with. So for this purpose, you also need to configure a template transformer. So if I go back to my incoming configuration, I can add a transformer here, and I need to look for the Magento to order restructured transformer. Here we can see that it has two options. The first option is the mutation day storage. So Alumio will use this to write the progress to that storage, so we know how far we already are. And also which field defines the status of the order. So you can have multiple status fields, so you can also define a custom one if needed. So let's hit save. Let's run it again. So now if I go back to the storage, so now it has been consumed again. If I go back to the storage, we will now see that the storage indeed is filled with two entities, as I now expected. So the first one is the identities. Here Alumio will store, we'll keep track of the entities that have already been processed combined with the date. So if we also take a look at the other entity in the storage, we can see a date field. So now Alumio will exclude order ID 2 with this timestamp. So when we are requesting data from Magento again, it's not going to create new tasks for the same entities. I can also verify this by going to the task overview. We now can see that we have two tasks added. We have an entity type that was automatically assigned by Alumio. We see an entity identifier that's constructed out of some specific information for this entity. But now also, if I go back to my incoming configuration, which I have here, and I'll run this multiple times, so let's run it twice. Okay, that's the first time. Now the second time, I will just go ahead and refresh the tasks. We can see that we will not get any new tasks because Alumio has stored the progress. Alumio knows, okay, I already have processed this order, so I'm not going to do anything with it. So now let's go ahead, go back to Magento. Let's create a new order. I'm going to create a new customer. And let's first add a product. I hope this one is in stock. Okay, this one is in stock. We're going to add an email, which is webinar@alumio.com. The first name will be Alumio. The last name will be webinar. Webinar street 123. Webinar city. Just going to fill in all the required fields. So let's go ahead and submit this order. Okay, so so now we have a new order. So now I'm expecting Alumio to pick this up. So now if I go back to the incoming configuration and we run it again, we can see it has been consumed. We can also go back to the task overview, refresh, and we can see that there's only one new task created for the new order that we created. We can also open this task, go to the entity data, and we can see everything about this task. So we can see, okay, it's the customer is webinar@alumio.com. The name is Alumio webinar. We can also see the billing address here, so we can see basically everything that we just created in Magento. So that's part one of the integration. So we use the template, we use the Magento connector to pull the data to Alumio. So it was quite simple. All we had to do is set up the the endpoint once using the HTTP client. And from that point on, we can just apply that HTTP client on all the connector components. So now if I go to the route and run this route, we can see that it will be processed. You see. Yeah, so here we have, so it failed to create this, so we can also go to the export messages. Okay, so this order failed because we have no delivery address, but let me take a look at the other orders. Yeah, so these ones were finished. We can also see that Alumio did some requests to F&O. So we can see it checked if a customer exists. Well, there was no customer in this case. It did a request to create a customer. And then at the end, it created an order. I can also verify this by going back to F&O and update my filter. Now we can see that we have 2 orders in F&O. So as you can see, that was way easier. It took way less time, but now we created a full integration where we sent orders from Magento to F&O. So to recap it, what we did, we created an HTTP client that was needed to connect to Magento. This contains the information such as the plugins, the authentication, any other shared information. Then we created an incoming configuration that uses the components of the connector, whereas the subscriber template provides us with the connectivity to the order endpoint of Magento. And the entity transformer template provides us with the information that's needed to map the Magento structure to the Alumio structure. Then I created an outcome configuration that uses the generic HTTP publisher to send data to a custom endpoint. But I use this template transformer to automatically see if the customer exists, if not, create a customer, and then format the sales order message. And what happened is we now have the sales orders in F&O. So I think that concludes this part of the webinar. So back to you, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you once again. Yes, quite impressive to have an order flow from e-commerce to Dynamics 365 and have it up and running in 30 minutes. So good job there. And now we're into the real exciting stuff. So yes, be prepared because I would like to ask you all to ask Jesse to show the real exciting stuff. So ask stuff about joining data streams, real-time adding API information in a build route, and much more, all depending on your requests. So please be ready. In other words, we're going to ask Jesse to show you how to benefit from using Alumio's advanced integration features. And we'd like to do this based upon your requests and questions. So please follow the link, which we will send in the chat right now. And if you follow this link, you will be part of the interactive session, and you will be able to ask Jesse questions and use cases, which will be demonstrated by Jesse in real time. And we will handle the interactive people first, and after that we will go to all the Q&As questions, because I see some questions in the Q&A already. So if you're a little bit camera shy, just switch off your camera, or if you're not having any questions, just join the session and learn from the other questions. or join the link later. So let's check if the link is on the screen, on the sheet, and I will check if it's already in the chat. Yeah, it's been pushed to the chat. We'll wait a couple of moments because our moderator is needed to approve the request. So please, it really helps to have this session interactive because you can also clarify your question.
So I see a question of Hans in the chat. So maybe we can start by answering that question while we wait for people to join.
Yeah.
So the question of Hans is, there's a serialized transformer, and then you can also select Serialize XML. So there's actually two transformers for the same purpose. Well, the reason for this is because at this point, there's not that many options for the serialized transformers. So let me just go here to connections and then to entity transformers. So the transformer that Hans is referring to is a mapper. It's a mapper transformer. So if I'm looking for serialize, we can see that we have many options here. So we have deserialize, deserialize form URL encoded, deserialize JSON, deserialize XML, and YAML. And we have the same for serializing. Well, I would just suggest you to use the serialized one and then select the one that's applicable to you, because the other ones will be deprecated in the near future, because you can imagine right now there's only 4 options, but we will add more and more and more. This would create a big list of transformers. So that's the reason why we have 2 of them. But right now they both do the same, so it doesn't matter. But for future proofing, I would select the serialize or deserialize one.
Okay, cool. Let's handle the second question from the chat. From Ibis Wuto. Do you see this one as well?
So we can handle this multiple ways, Ibis.
Could you first rephrase the question for all the...
So the question of Ibis is there any way to retry tasks at a specific time interval? So for instance, can you retry a task every 10 minutes for an X amount of times? We can do this 2 ways. The first one is also suggested by Johan in the chat, so thank you for that. And that's through a health check. So what we can do is we can go to settings and then to health checks, and we can add a new health check. And I can call this retry tasks for retry failed tasks, something like this. And I can go to the settings and I can select the task status repair. And down here I can define criteria. So for example, I can say, okay, if the status equals failed and the route is, maybe I only want to do it for specific routes. So for example, orders from system A to system B, and they are older than 1 hour, or doesn't really matter. Then we can retry them and set them to the queue again, and we can make this more advanced if needed. So that's option 1. And this is then executed by a cron. So every minute, Alumio will check, okay, are there any tasks that match my criteria? If that's not the case, the other way we can do it is through, for example, the HTTP client. So if we are connecting to a SOAP API, GraphQL API, or maybe an HTTP REST API, we can add a plugin to our HTTP client. We can retry requests on failure. So you can fully configure this the way you want. So if let's say, okay, I can retry it 5 times, wait 60 seconds or 600 seconds. And so now it will be retried 5 times with delays of 10 minutes in between. And you can also even configure it to only execute this when there's a certain HTTP response code. So there's 2 ways of achieving what you would like. Hopefully this answered your question, Ibis.
Yeah. So we have the first 2 people joining the interactive session. So welcome Tommy, and welcome Hank. So first ask Tommy to ask the question, and after that we'll ask Hank, of course. So Tommy, If you could unmute yourself, or if
yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, the question was if you want to, let's say you want to get, you want to post data to a REST API, and you need to send parameters that you get from another. You have to get the data, the parameters from another REST API in that same system, this endpoint. For example, you have Shopify, you need to update the inventory levels, but you need to get the Shopify ID identifier and location identifiers. Can you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can achieve this using the transformers. So let's say I'm going to quickly create a connection. So let's say we have this public API. It will return users, and these users, they also have, no, let's do it the other way around. We are going to pull posts from the system, and these posts, they have a user ID. So we need to pull this information on the user, right? I think that's your use case.
Yeah, I mean, it's two different APIs. I need to get actually maybe even three. I need to get the item IDs and the location ID, and then post the inventory level based on data from another system.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so let me just do this, and I think that will answer your question. And if it doesn't, then we can just continue on that. So what we are going to do, we are going to create an in configuration that pulls these posts. So I'm going to call it get posts. I'm going to select the generic HTTP subscriber. We will provide a URL. It will be the default client, and then we just quickly add a transformer to split it up, because we will get an array of objects, and I want to get individual tasks. And when I create this, I will create a route for this, get posts and enrich, doesn't really matter. I'm going to select this incoming configuration, and let's send it somewhere. Or let's send it here. Okay. So when we pull this data, so when we do this API call, we are only doing one API call. We are getting a lot of tasks, but that's quite simple, right? And so your question is, how can I do additional API calls, combine the data, and then do my final API call based on that result?
Yeah.
So what I can do, I can copy this data.
Okay.
I can create a transformer, and I can say, okay, I will make this a little bit bigger. So we will call this enrich post data, something like that. I'm going to select the data transformer, and we can do it two ways. So we can, or we can do it multiple ways, but I'm going to do a REST API call. So I'm going to use a merger transformer, which takes the data transformer as input and has a template as output. So the data transformer I'm going to use is the HTTP transformer. So this allows me to do a API call whenever this piece of JSON is being processed, right? So the API call I would like to do is I want to get the user that's tied to the specific post. In this case, I can provide the user ID, and I will get the user in return. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this URL, paste it here. We're going to use the default client, and then we have the template, and we can write the result of this API call somewhere on our current data object. So I'm going to say I'm going to introduce the user key, and I'm going to take the entire result. So when I press run test, okay, this is incorrect because we have user ID 10, but I pulled user ID 1. So we need to make this dynamic. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make this a placeholder or a variable. And I'm going to, within that, I'm going to define the path to the user ID field. So now Alumio will take the value of the user ID field and provide it with this request. So now I will get user ID 10. So if I change this to 7, it will be user ID 7, right? So that's the step one. So that we did the API call, the first API call. Then now maybe what I also want to do, I need to pull more information. So I have a post with an ID, but under each post, there's also a comment. And I can provide a filter in the request where I provide a post ID, and I will get all the comments that are relevant to this post. So let's just copy this, and we can add another transformer. I can paste the URL in here. Here I can use the placeholder notation. the default client and we'll write this to the comments key. Now we can see that I'm doing something wrong. I'm doing wrong. I think I have to provide it here, so sorry for that. So Alumio will automatically translate this to a get parameter string because we are doing a get request. If we are doing a post request, it will send it as form data. So when I press run, we can see it retrieved all the comments for this specific post. So and from that point on, you can create the final request, using whatever logic you need. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I think so for now. Thank you.
Okay, great, no problem.
Thank you, Tommy. Let's unmute Hank. And Tommy, if you have more questions, feel free to ask or to rejoin the session. Hank, hi. Hank, you're unmuted. I hope you're still there. And if you can share your question, challenge to Jesse. Anytime from now, and till we hear you, we will have a look through the Q&A questions. Yes. The first one in the Q&A: is it possible to create an external alert? So if a route fails, send out an alert by, for example, email.
Yes, so your Alumio environment is automatically configured to do so. So that works through Elasticsearch. Right now, it's not an option in the user interface yet. So that's something we need to add. But yes, we can send those errors by email or by text message or Teams message, whatever your integration requires.
Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, we use Elastic Kibana, and Kibana offers by default all kind of communication opportunities. We can configure that to them, and some of the partners or customers also have access to do that itself. And on the roadmap, coming soon is a user interface for that. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. So we provide you with the access to do so, and we also provide you with instructions how to do so. But yeah, we are going to add it to the user interface, but it's not there yet.
Okay. Then the next question: is it possible to add validations, such as using schemes for different data types? And this is a question which we can interpret on multiple ways, probably. What's your interpretation on this one, Jesse?
So I assume you want to automatically validate if the fields contain the data that you're expecting. So if you're processing prices, you likely want to check if it's a float or a double. If you're processing a name, likely should be a string. And you want to automatically validate a full schema of incoming data against what you have predefined. That is my interpretation of the question. And yes, we can do this. So we have a client and then an entity type. So I already created one. So the F&O sales order header, and down here we can provide a schema. And the schema is a JSON schema. So my knowledge on this, I don't have it on the top of my head, but we have an article on this. So let me just go ahead and copy what's being described there.
So what you see now is our knowledge base. We have a big knowledge base with all kind of questions already asked. So it's all open, docs.alumio.com, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah, we have two. We have docs.alumio.com and we have support.alumio.com. And support.alumio.com is a newer version, and we are currently in a migration process to move everything from the docs to support. Okay. But anyway, we use a JSON schema for that. So let me just go ahead and paste it in here. A JSON schema, it's also, I think there's a URL provided here. So we have json-schema.org that describes how you can use JSON schema. But we also have this article that gives you an idea how to implement it within Alumio. But anyway, we can say, okay, we have a schema. We say, okay, the type is an object. So if we are talking about the sales order header, we are talking about an object. It should have 3 properties in this case, which is an SKU, which is of the type string. We have a price, which is of the type integer, but also has a minimum value of 1. And we have a property enabled, which is of a type Boolean, and that's an enum value of either true or false, which is an obsolete check, I suppose, because here we already check whether it's true or false. And then we say, okay, all the 3 properties are required. So let me just quickly create a new one for this. I think it's better for the demo purpose. I will call this example entity type validation. And when I go back, when I save this, and I go to connections and to entity transformers, we can create a new transformer, validate data against entity type. I will select the validates the entity type. No, I need to select 2 transformers. The first one is I need to set the entity type. So it will be the example entity type validation. And the second one is actually validating the entity type. So now if I have, let's say I have a data object which contains a name, which is 1, 2, 3 test. I press run test, we will get no result because our data does not match the schema. Because if we take a look at the schema again, we are saying, okay, there should be a SKU property, a price property, and a enabled property. So let's change this. So let's add an SKU, test product, add a price. I'm going to add a price of 0, which does not match the validation, and I'm going to add an enabled, which is a true. And when I press run, it will still fail because yes, we do have the 3 properties, but the price does not match the minimum of 1. So if we take a look here, we can see that we defined a minimum of 1. So now if I change this price to 1 and I press run, now it will come true. So this way we can automatically validate our data. You can make it as hard as you would like. You just need to take a look at what the JSON schema spec allows you to do. And yeah, that's how you apply it.
Okay, thanks for explaining that one. Henk had some problems with his microphone, but he asked a question in the chat, and I think it's on the screen now. Is it possible to hide sensitive data like username, password, and tokens from the logging and user interface? A very good question regarding security.
Yeah, it's a good question. So yes, we can do that by setting it in an environment variable. So if we go to settings and then to environment variables, I will define a new environment variable, and I call this the secret API token, something like this. The value will be very secret. So I'm going to save it. It's encrypted. So now if we go back to the overview, we can see that we have a secret API token, which is also encrypted. Now let me take this value, go to an HTTP client of choice. So I'm going to use the default client in this case, and I'm going to add a header here. So let's say I'm going to add a request header, and it will be test header, and the value will be the secret API token, right? So now what Alumio will do, whenever I use this default client, it's going to add a header called test header, and it's going to provide the value of the secret API token environment variable. So when I hit save, and I do a request to the system, so let's get the get post income configuration because that uses the default client, HTTP client. So when I press run, and I go take a look at the logs, once they are available, so these are being offloaded to Elasticsearch. Are we also seeing the request header? Okay, this is not a good example. So expecting the request header to show up there. So let me set it to full logging and try it once more. But if you have an environment variable and you encrypt it, then it will be stripped from the logs. Yeah, so for some reason it's not being shown for the system. So let me just try one more system. And otherwise, we still have the example of the FNO connection that we created. Yeah, so the request header is for some reason not being shown. Anyway, let me go to one of the FNO sales order connections that we had, or tasks that we had. And we go to the import messages, we can see that sensitive data is being removed from the logging. So here we can see that the bearer token is redacted because we used environment variables to set up the connection. So here we have the client secret, token URL, and so on. They are encrypted. So a part of the data is encrypted. So Alumio will just remove the entire string. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it's clear, and if not, please ask more questions in chat or come live. So please, if you have any questions, it's very interactive to go live. Here we have Ruud Welten. Hi, Ruud.
Okay, can the define schema for an entity type also be automatically filtered, converted, or completed? For example, filter and remove unneeded fields, add default values for missing properties. Yeah, it's a good question, Ruud. So I'm not entirely sure if we can do that through the entity types, but we can certainly do it through a transformer. So I can go to connections and then to entity transformers. And I can define let's say I'm going to define my product. So my product has this SKU, which is test 1, 2, 3. We have the price, which is 0, but we are not going to provide whether it's enabled or not. So now if I configure the transformers again, so I'm going to set the entity type. I'm going to validate the entity type, and I will press run test. Now it will fail. But likely, a product will always have an enabled status, right? So either it's enabled or it's disabled. So what we can do, if the enabled field is not provided, we can set a default value of false, for example. So I can assume you can do it through the JSON schema, but I'm not entirely sure. So that's why I'm going to do it through a transformer. But I'm going to add a new data transformer. I'm going to add a list mapper. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to add the value setter. And I'm going to set the enabled key. What I'm going to do is I'm going to provide the value of enabled. But now, so I'm going to set the enabled key with the value of enabled. And when I press run test, it will fail because enabled does not exist. But we can also provide an alternative value here. So this can be something like, I think this is configured only to accept strings. So what you need to do is something like false, right? And then, okay, so it will still fail because this is a string. We can cast it to a bool. And then I was expecting this to work. So let me see what's happening. Okay, so likely something wrong with my JSON schema, but then just let me make this through. And I guess the same principle applies. Oh, the price should be higher than 1. That's right. So now it works. And if I change this back to false, then it will also work, right? So that's one way. We can also do it through a list mapper. I can do a key accessor, which I will leave empty, and then I can do an inherit from supply data. So I can say, okay, if the SKU doesn't exist, make it no SKU present. If the price doesn't exist, make the price 1000. And if enabled does not exist, make it false. And when I press run test, enabled will be provided by this schema, but the other fields will not be overwritten because we already have the SKU field and we have the price field. So what this mapper will do, it will only add fields that are currently missing. So if I now remove the SKU field, so we only have the price field, we can see that it added those 2 fields. Now, if I remove everything, we can see it fully inherited the data from this transformer. So this transformer, this mapper will only complete the data. And then again, if you want to filter, you can just create a filter through through Alumio. So we can create like a data filter. So let's say I'm going to add let's say I'm first going to add a key that we don't need. So something like ERP reference is test. Now we have this ERP reference, but we don't need it. So I could create like a key filter to remove that field or other fields that might need to be removed. So now it's removed from our data. So hopefully this answers your question, Ruud.
Yeah, and then we can have a parallel in-depth session to discuss if this is also possible with the data scheme. We're open to do that. Let's go to the Q&A. I have a question from an anonymous. For incoming XML files, there is a possibility the node is an array or an object. How can you check this? Could you explain the question, yes, sir, and then hopefully give the answer? Because business-wise, I'm not sure, but for an incoming XML file,
so for an incoming XML file, there's a possibility the node is an array or an object. So either I think the question is you get one node, so we get only a single object, or we get an array. So basically that you're saying you're getting an XML file, I suppose, in two different formats. Or in that case, I would advise you to create two separate incoming configurations because you need to be reliable what type of format it is. But if that's not the case, so let's say that's not possible or for whatever reason you don't want to do it, again, transformers will be of help. So you can do something like a conditional transformer. And we can, for example, check if a certain field, such as, I don't know, products is of the type array, is not of the type array, So in this case, it's not an array, so it's an object, but we want, for example, it's easier to always work with either objects or with arrays. And we can create an array of it, or we can do it the other way around. If products is an array, we can do get branches from a pattern to make individual objects out of it. So we can say, okay, products.star, something like this. Now, see if I'm smart enough. Yeah, so now we will get a, so now this is executed because this is an array. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, one Q&A question is maybe related to this one. Can I combine two data flows? For example, the data of my products are coming from 3 APIs, products, categories, and attributes. How can I combine these data flows? Maybe it's related because the other data from the XML is
I
also...
think it's related to the question of Tommy. So again, this is through the transformers. Like I showed you, we can do additional API calls. So we can do, for example, write an HTTP transformer to do a REST API call. And this can be JSON or XML, YAML, or form URL encoded. But we can, for example, also do a SOAP transformer. So we can do a SOAP API call and so on. So you can use transformers. They basically enable you to do everything within your integration.
And are you also using... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So if you I'm from the marketing department, so I'm not that technical, but if you have 3 data streams and you would like to combine this data, I know that you use storages, so you make 3 incoming connections and you put it in the storage and then you normalize it. Did you also already shown this answer, or is this a different use case?
Yeah, so it's also a possibility. So what we can also do is we can create a storage. So we can create a custom storage. We call this, for example, enriched post, something like that. And define a path, enriched post. What we then can do, we can create a route. I'm not going to do it right now, but we can hypothetically create a route that has an outgoing configuration that writes the result to the storage, to an internal storage. So I said during all my examples, I talked about external systems, but we can also write to an external system, which is the Alumio storage. And I can write data to this enriched post storage. So we can say, okay, we have a product SKU. So what we then can do, we can pull data from multiple sources, write everything to a storage, and only when the storage is complete, which we can again check by filtering, we can send the data to the final destination. So this is especially useful for when you are not sure when the data is complete. So in some cases, it's very procedural. So something is added to one system and then it's available in all other systems. But it's also very possible that you are going to create a product, for example, in your ERP system, but then the further enrichments are added way later. So maybe you have some images that are needed before you send it to the e-commerce system, but those images might be added only a week after. So then it's hard to create a route where you're going to pull the images real time because they will not be there. They will likely not be there. So what you then would do is you would create routes to write this data to a storage. So using this storage publisher. Then only then when it's finished, you will send the data to the e-commerce system. So we can also create an incoming configuration that reads the data from this internal storage. So this way you can create all those various scenarios that you might need to solve your integration challenges.
Okay, thanks a lot for explaining this one. Another question from the Q&A. How can you handle pagination in your request? So if there are 100 orders at the endpoints, yeah, you see it on the screen.
Yeah, so there's various ways, but what you would do is you would again use a storage. So the storage is a very hybrid, versatile solution, but you would use a storage to store the pagination. Let me see if I can think of a example quickly. Yeah, so let's say what we can do is I'm going to pull this. We have this get posts, and so instead of pulling all the posts, I'm going to pull them one by one. So what we're going to do, I'm going to copy this here. I'm going to provide a post ID in here. So this will be a variable. So we need to make sure that this variable, the post ID, exists before we do this request. So now if I press save, and let me just go to quickly to the task overview and set everything that's currently open. Skip them, because I think there's quite some. Okay, so now when I run this, the first time I'm getting an error. Why am I getting an error? Yeah, the post ID does not exist. That's expected. So that's the first challenge. So what I did not describe yet during either of the webinars, we also support input transformers. And with the input transformers, we can create data or construct a data object that we can pass with this API call that's being performed by this incoming configuration. So I'm going to select here, I'm going to select the value setter, and we are going to introduce the post ID key. I'm going to just for now set it to a hard-coded value of 1. We'll hit save, and now when I press run incoming, and I go to the task overview, we will see that we have one new task. But every time I run the same incoming, I will get the same task, right? The same post. It's all post ID 1 because it's hard-coded. So this is your question. You want to have pagination to store the process, the progress. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a storage. I'm going to call this posts pagination. And what we need to do, we need the transformer to write the progress to the storage, and then we can use the input transformer to read this progress from this from that same storage. So I'm going to go to connections, to entity transformers. I'm going to call this post pagination. I'm going to select the data transformer. And what we are going to do, we are going to take the task data, because this will be used to calculate the next post ID. I'm going to paste it in here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the value setter. to calculate the next ID. So I'm going to introduce a key that's called next ID, which consists out of two values. The first value is the value of ID. And the second value is 1. So it's just hard-coded. So now when I press run test, we can see we have a next ID field, which is an array that has 1 and 1. Now we'll execute a mapper on this. So I can use an operator mapper, and I can do a addition. Now when I press run test, the next ID will be 2. And now if this was ID 3, the next ID would be 4. If this was ID 30, the next ID would be 31, and so on. So this is one specific way of pagination, but you can also check if there's a next link and take the next link and write that to the storage, and then read that next link, the next request. But for this case, I'm going to use this ID and do this calculation. So what I need to do, I need to write this result to the storage. So I'm going to do a write content to storage transformer. I'm going to select the, I'm going to select the write to storage transformer. The storage will be the post pagination. The storage path will be post ID, and the source path will be next ID. But that's maybe rather confusing, so let me just call them both next ID. So when I press run test, this is executed. When I go to the storage, it will have now one entity with the value of 31. And now if I change this to something else, it will value of 32. And now when I refresh the pagination, it will also be 32, right? So now what we have a transformer. So I'm going to save this. That will make sure that we are progressing. And now we need to at least we'll store the next ID to the storage. So now we need to read this data, so we pass it with the API call. So I'm going to go back to this incoming configuration. I'm going to add the transformer in here that we just created, post pagination. And I'm going to update this input transformer. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a chain. I'm going to do a get from storage. We are going to read from the post pagination storage. Storage path will be next ID. Destination path is post ID because we are expecting a post ID here. Now when I hit save, I press run incoming, and I go back to the task overview. You can see, okay, 32 in here, right? So when I open this task, we see, okay, this is ID 32. If I run it again, and I go back to the task overview, we have 33. If I run it, let me just run it a few more times and refresh this. We can see it's keep processing, right? 33, 34, 35. I need to open this one, 36. 37, and so on. So you are able to tailor this to whatever you need. So I provide this example with a ID that needs to be incremented, but we can also do it with a next link or whatever.
Thanks. Another one, still open, mapping data to data schemes. Maybe the moderator can, yeah, that's the one. How is this working? And it's referring to probably the picture I showed that to simplify your IT landscape and to use connected packages from our marketplace, it's very good to connect your incoming to the data scheme. So where can we find it? How does it work? And yeah.
Yes. So where can you find the data schemes? I think the first part of the question is, how is it working? Okay, so always if you're going to connect to systems, you have data in format A and you have data in format B. So data in the format where it came from, and data in the format where it has to go to, right? So what we decided is, okay, how can we simplify this process? So we decided to add an extra layer. So I hear you thinking, an extra layer doesn't that make it more complex? Initially, yes, but what it also does, it allows you to reuse configurations. So if we have one project where we are going to connect Magento to SAP, then if we use this strategy where we are going to use an Alumio schema, we can reuse both parts. So if I have a next project, which is Magento to Business Central, I already have all the configurations from Magento to Alumio, and I only need to create the part from Alumio to Business Central. If I would do a one-on-one mapping, so I would do a point-to-point mapping, then I would have nothing. It would be all useless. That's not the right word, but I would not be able to reuse those configurations. And also, it's very common that companies, they change their systems, right? So maybe at some point they will no longer use Magento, but they decide to move to Shopify, or they decide to move to Shopware. Then also, if they use the connector strategy, they just have to change the connector, and most of it will still work. They only have to maybe update the mappings to the Shopware specific fields. So that's the idea behind it. So this requires you to map the incoming data using transformers to an Alumio schema, and Alumio schemas can be found on schemas.alumio.com. And here we can find a few of the schemas. So for example, we can see the product schema. So if I click on it, I can scroll down and I can see the properties that define a product. So we say, okay, we have a brand. So if I click on it, I will be brought to the brand, which is a string or an array of strings. So maybe you have multiple brands. We have a category, again, which can be an item list, which is a single item, or it's an array of item lists. So there's all of these properties defining a product. But obviously, the way we define a product might not necessarily be the way you define a product. So you can also add additional information using the additional property. So the additional property is available on all the Alumio schemas that we offer. So this way you can always add the fields that you need in your integration, but are not present on the default schema. And now the question was removed from my screen, so I'm not sure if I answered all the parts of the question.
I think so. I'll check it one more time. Where can I find the data schemes? It's on schemes.alumio.com?
Yeah, schemas with an A in the end.
And yeah, how to do the mapping with the transformers? Is it clear already? Can you relate to other use cases, or is it specific? How do you connect it using the transformers?
So I can give a small example. So let's say we have a customer. So I think we have let me go back to the overview. We have a person, which is a customer. Or we also actually have a customer. Okay, so when we take a look at the customer, we have an address, we have a given name, we have a family name and an email and so on. So let's just map the given name, the family name, and the email. Okay, so let's take a look at this random system. So this random system contains some user information, right? So okay, we do have a email field, but we do not have a given name or family name field. So we need to create that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this user data. I'm going to create an entity transformer. I'm going to paste this in here. We'll do a data transformer. I'm going to use the value setter to introduce a key and call this Alumio customer schema. And then I can just quite simply map it to whatever it needs to be. So I will make this an object. So okay, we say we have an email field. Like this. We have a given name field. Just the value of the name field. We also have a family name field, which is the same. So you can map all the fields that you need to. So now when we take a look here, we have those fields, right? Okay, this is not correct because in the Alumio schema, we expect the given name and the family name separated. Well, in this incoming format, it's in one string, right? So we maybe need to apply a mapper to this. So what we can do is I will add a configuration. I will call this name. And I'm going to, it's the value of name. And we're going to apply a mapper on this. We are going to explode it to an array based on the first space. And we are doing a limit of 2. So the first word will become the first name and the second, and all the other words will become the last name. So I will update this configuration to select the first item of the array and the second one. Now it was split up, and this way we can define those schemas. So as you can see, it's quite easy. It really depends on the complexity of your schema and the requirements of your integration. But once you do this, then let's say you're going to send this customer to Magento, well, our connector already has configurations to map the data from the Alumio schema to the Magento format, so you don't have to do anything for that. So that's where you win your time.
Okay, sounds clear. A new question from arrived. I need to fetch a recently updated product list from an endpoint and save it into a local storage as a queue. How can I process them in batches of items every 2 hours? So maybe you can put it on the screen as well, our dear moderators. Yep.
Yeah, so let me see. Okay, so what we can do, we can create a incoming configuration. So I already described the process of how you can write data to a local storage. We can then create an incoming configuration, and I can select the merged storage subscriber, and I can select the storage. And what this will do, it will read all the items in the storage at once. Okay, so when I run this once, and there's 1,000 items in the storage, I will get one task with all the 1,000 items. So let's say we are getting all these users. Let me just copy this result. I'm going to go to connections and then to entity transformers. I want to split it up in batches of, let's say, 2 items. So I'm going to paste it here. Let's say we have users, right? We have the users, and now I'm going to do a data transformer. I'm going to do a value mapper. I'm going to map the users key. I'm going to split it in chunks. I'm going to split it in chunks of 2. So when I press run, we can see that the array now has been split in multiple arrays, right? And now what I can do is I should have selected a different, let me just copy this. So now our new result has 5, the users contains 5 arrays with each 2 items within that array. So each 2 users. So this way we have batches of 2. So let me just paste it in here. Now what we can do is we can create a get branches from a pattern transformer, which we will base on users.star. When we press run test, we will have each batch separately. And this way we can process it in batches or in chunks.
Sounds logic and easy. And I think that's all about Alumio. It's not complex. You need to understand the transformers and how to use it, and at the end you need to understand the data flow. If you create custom integrations, because otherwise you can just use the connector packages. Do we have more questions? I don't think so. And I think we did quite a good job. We're running to the 2 hours. So if there's no new questions, I would like to thank you all for joining the event, this webinar, and for, of course, a big thank you for Jesse for helping us out with all the use cases. And you for being such a great audience. We really like your questions and the active sessions, and we really appreciate it. And you give us some feedback. You can do this by clicking the icon on the right of your screen, the bell icon, and you can rate us, and it really helps us to get better. And if you would like to learn more about how to organize your integration project, we hope to see you again in our webinar of 9th of December. In this webinar, we will present the 5 key steps for successfully implementing integrations. So it's not a technical track, but it is very important in order to know how to approach your integration project. Have a good day, enjoy, and big thanks from us.
Thank you.